In 1885, if your child was teething, your druggist had something for that. It came in a small brown glass bottle with a paper label, cost about 35 cents, and was called Lloyd's Cocaine Toothache Drops. The label said it was for toothache. It said it was suitable for children. It did not say what was in it. Your druggist did not tell you what was in it either. Not because he was hiding something, because nobody asked, because there was nothing unusual about it, because it was sitting on the shelf between the cough syrup and the liver pills, and the mother who bought it for her baby and the druggist who sold it to her were both operating inside a world where this was simply how things worked. The bottle contained cocaine. Not a trace of cocaine, not a homeopathic dilution. Cocaine, in a concentration sufficient to numb the gums of a teething infant and produce in that infant a brief, observable calm. The kind of calm that made the mother come back and buy another bottle. That is not the remarkable part of this story. The remarkable part is what happened when people found out, and what a specific, named, documented group of men did to make sure that finding out took as long as possible. Stay with me. Because by the time this is over, you will understand something about the label on every bottle in your medicine cabinet that most people have never thought to question. To understand the patent medicine industry at its peak, you have to understand how completely it was woven into the fabric of ordinary American life by 1900. Patent medicines were not sold in the back of dark shops by suspicious characters. They were advertised on the front pages of newspapers. They were listed in the Sears Roebuck mail order catalogue between gardening tools and ladies' corsets, available to any household in America with a stamp and a few coins. They were endorsed by clergymen, by local politicians, by newspaper editors, who received a substantial portion of their advertising revenue from the companies that made them. They were given to babies. They were taken by pregnant women. They were used by soldiers, by factory workers, by farmers, by everyone. The industry was enormous. By 1900, Americans were spending approximately $80 million a year on patent medicines. That is the equivalent of well over $2 billion today. The industry employed thousands of people, supported hundreds of newspapers through advertising contracts, and had built over several decades a distribution network that reached into every town and rural community in the country. And the products themselves covered an extraordinary range of complaints. There was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, marketed specifically for infants during teething, described in its advertising as a mother's friend, guaranteed to soothe the most fretful child. There was Ayer's cherry pectoral for coughs and lung complaints. There was Peruna, sold as a catarrh remedy, and one of the best-selling patent medicines of the era. There was Hamlin's Wizard Oil, good for pain of any kind in any location. There was Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound for women's complaints, which contained a significant quantity of alcohol. There was Dr. James' soothing syrup powder, Dr. Barker's blood builder, Dr. Fenner's golden relief. Most of them shared two characteristics. They made claims that bore no relationship to any clinical evidence, and they did not disclose their ingredients. This was not illegal. There was no law requiring them to. The word patent in patent medicine was largely a marketing term by this point. It did not refer to an actual patent, which would have required public disclosure of the formula. It referred to a kind of mystique, a secret formula, a proprietary process. The secrecy was the product. Let me tell you what was actually in some of these products, because the documentation exists. And the documentation is extraordinary. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, the one marketed specifically for teething infants, contained morphine, not in a trivial quantity. A standard dose for an infant contained approximately 65 milligrams of morphine sulfate. The product had been on the market since 1849. It was still being sold in 1911. A British medical journal analysed it in 1884 and published the findings. The findings were not disputed. Sales did not decrease. The Sears Roebuck catalogue for 1897 listed, among its pharmaceutical offerings, a hypodermic kit, syringe, needles, and 2 vials of cocaine and morphine for $1.50. It listed laudanum, which is tincture of opium, as a standard item. It listed cocaine, based preparations without restriction or age qualification. The catalog went to rural households across America that had no pharmacy within 30 miles. You ordered it like you ordered seed corn. Bayer, the German pharmaceutical company, began marketing a product in 1898 that they called heroin. The name was a trademark, derived from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic or powerful. They marketed it as a cough suppressant, and specifically as a non-addictive substitute for morphine. They sent free samples to physicians across Europe and America. The product was available without prescription. The advertising copy described it as particularly suitable for children suffering from coughs and respiratory complaints. Bayer knew from their own clinical observations that patients developed tolerance to the drug. They described this in their internal communications. The word they did not use in their marketing was addiction. Cocaine toothache drops were not a niche product. Multiple manufacturers produced them. They were sold in pharmacies across the country. The logic was medically sound in a narrow sense. Cocaine is a genuine topical anesthetic and does numb the gums. What the label did not mention was the systemic absorption, the effect on the infant's central nervous system, the dependency that could develop with repeated use, or the fact that the observed calming of the child was not the relief of pain, but the effect of a powerful stimulant on a developing brain. The cocaine was doing what cocaine does. It was just doing it to babies. Now here is where the story stops being about products and starts being about power. By 1900, a substantial number of people in America knew roughly what was in these products. Physicians who paid attention had noticed the pattern. Infants who had been given soothing syrups over extended periods displayed signs of withdrawal when the syrup was stopped. Chemists who had analyzed the products had published their findings. A handful of journalists had written about it. None of this had produced meaningful change, for a reason that is specific and documented and worth understanding precisely. The patent medicine industry had, over several decades, constructed a system for suppressing exactly this kind of information. The mechanism was the advertising contract. When a patent medicine company placed an advertisement in a newspaper, and these companies were among the largest advertisers in American print media, the contract they signed contained a clause. The clause varied in its exact language from contract to contract, but its effect was consistent. It stipulated that the advertising contract would become void, and all fees would be forfeit, if the state in which the newspaper was published passed any law requiring the disclosure of ingredients in patent medicines, or restricting or taxing the sale of such medicines. In the trade, this came to be known as the Red Clause. It was not a secret, it was standard practice. The effect was precisely what it was designed to produce. Newspaper editors across the country, editors who depended on patent medicine advertising for a significant portion of their revenue, had a direct financial incentive to ensure that no such legislation passed. They did not need to be instructed to oppose labeling laws. The contract made the incentive automatic. An editor who allowed his paper to support ingredient disclosure legislation was an editor who would lose his patent medicine advertising contracts when that legislation passed. The math was simple. The behavior it produced was consistent. Samuel Hopkins Adams understood this mechanism before he wrote a single word of what would become the most important piece of investigative journalism in the history of American consumer protection. Adams was a reporter for Collier's Weekly, a nationally circulated magazine with a reputation for serious journalism. In 1905 he published a series of articles under the collective title, The Great American Fraud. The series ran over several months and was specific in a way that the industry had not previously encountered. Adams did not write in generalities about the dangers of patent medicines. He named products. He named ingredients. He named the newspapers that carried the advertising, and described the Red Clause contracts that bound them. He named the members of the Proprietary Association of America, the trade organization that represented the patent medicine manufacturers, and described their lobbying activities in Washington. He published facsimiles of documents. He quoted congressional testimony. The response from the industry was what you would expect. They threatened legal action. They pressured Collier's advertisers. They questioned Adams' credentials and motivations. Several newspapers that had been running the Red Clause contracts refused to cover the series at all, or ran dismissive responses, what the industry had not fully accounted for was Harvey Wiley. Harvey Washington Wiley was the chief chemist of the United States Department of Agriculture. He had been arguing for federal food and drug regulation since the 1880s. He had watched 12 attempts at federal legislation fail, each one killed in committee or strangled by industry lobbying before it reached a floor vote. He had developed in that time a precise and detailed understanding of exactly how the opposition worked and who funded it. In 1902, Wiley had established what the press called the Poison Squad, a group of 12 young male volunteers, all government employees, who agreed to eat meals laced with various chemical preservatives and adulterants, then common in processed food, so that Wiley could document the effects. The experiment was not subtle. The men got sick. The press covered it extensively. The public was, for the first time, paying genuine attention to the question of what was in their food and medicine. Wiley understood that the patent medicine industry's power came from two sources: the advertising revenue that silenced newspapers and the congressional relationships built with lobbying money over decades. The Adams series had wounded the first. Wiley spent the next year working the second. The Pure Food and Drug Act was signed by President Theodore Roosevelt on the 30th of June, 1906. It was the first federal law to regulate the contents and labeling of food and medicine in the United States. Its passage had taken more than 20 years of effort by Wiley and a coalition of women's groups, physicians, journalists, and reform-minded legislators. Here is what the act required, and here, equally, is what it did not require, because the second part is what almost every account of this story leaves out. The act required that if a product contained any of 11 specified substances — alcohol, morphine, opium, cocaine, heroin, cannabis, chloroform, cannabis, indica, chloral hydrate, acetanilide, or any derivative of these — the label must say so and must state the quantity. It prohibited false or misleading statements on labels. It required that the label accurately represent the contents. It did not ban any of these substances. It did not prohibit their sale. It did not prevent a manufacturer from putting cocaine in a product intended for children. It required only that if cocaine was present, the label must say so. Cocaine remained legal in patent medicines until the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914. Heroin remained available for medical prescribing until 1924. Morphine-based products marketed for infants continued to be sold, with the ingredient now disclosed on the label, for years after 1906. Some mothers, reading the label for the first time, simply accepted the information and continued buying the product. The 1906 Act was a genuine achievement. It was also substantially weaker than what Wiley and the reformers had sought. The final version had been negotiated down through a legislative process in which the patent medicine industry and food manufacturers had fought every provision. The penalty provisions were reduced, the enforcement mechanisms were limited. The scope of the labeling requirements was narrower than the original bill. Wiley spent the remaining years of his career fighting the industry's attempts to further weaken even the compromised law that had passed. He resigned from the Department of Agriculture in 1912, exhausted and outmaneuvered. He continued writing and speaking about food and drug safety until his death in 1930. I want to tell you about the infant mortality data because it is specific, and it is documented, and it is the part of this story that is hardest to hold without looking away. In 1911, the American Medical Association compiled data on infant deaths associated with patent medicine use and submitted it to Congress as part of a campaign to strengthen the 1906 Act. The testimony included named cases. It included physicians who had identified the cause of an infant's death as morphine poisoning and traced it to a commercially sold soothing syrup. It included the documented analysis of products still being sold after 1906. Products that now carried the required disclosure of morphine content on their labels. The testimony documented that Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, after the 1906 Act required disclosure, had continued to list morphine on its label and continued to be sold without restriction until 1911, when the British government finally banned it. It was not banned in the United States by federal law. It was eventually withdrawn from the American market by its manufacturer in the face of sustained medical and public pressure. The American Medical Association's analysis found that in the years between 1906 and 1911, in the period when labels were required to disclose morphine content, the products continued to sell. The disclosure had not, by itself, stopped the harm. What stopped it, eventually, was not a single law but an accumulation. The 1906 Act, the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914, the continued work of medical organizations, the gradual shift in public understanding of addiction, and the slow withdrawal of products that could no longer be marketed without the kind of scrutiny their manufacturers preferred to avoid. Here is the thing I keep returning to when I read through the congressional testimony, and the Collier's articles and the Proprietary Association's own records, which have been in the public archive for over a century. The druggist who sold the cocaine toothache drops was not a villain. The mother who bought them was not negligent. The physician who recommended a soothing syrup for a colicky infant was not corrupt. They were all operating inside a system that had been deliberately constructed to keep them from knowing what they were handling. The secrecy was not incidental. It was the business model. The red clause existed because the industry understood, clearly and explicitly, that disclosure would hurt sales. They wrote that understanding into their advertising contracts and called it standard practice. The people who knew were the members of the Proprietary Association of America, sitting in their meetings, reviewing their Red Clause contracts, monitoring the progress of labeling legislation in state capitals and in Washington, and deploying their advertising budgets to ensure that the newspapers their customers read would not be the newspapers that told them what was in the bottle. That is documented. It is in the congressional record. It is in the archives of the Army. It is in Samuel Hopkins Adams articles, which named the names and reproduced the documents, and are still available to read. The label on the bottle said, "For toothache, for fretful infants, a mother's friend." What it was never allowed to say, what the men in those meetings spent decades and considerable money ensuring it would not say, was the one thing that would have changed everything. What was in it? If this changed the way you think about the label on a medicine bottle, about what it tells you and what it has historically been designed to leave out, then you understand something most people accept without question. Labels tell you what the law requires them to tell you, not more. And for a long time in this country, the law required nothing. The fight to change that took 20 years. A Poison Squad, a magazine series that named the names, and a coalition of women's organizations who understood before Congress, did what was happening to the babies. The druggist who sold cocaine toothache drops in 1885 retired. Eventually the Red Clause contracts expired. The products were reformulated or withdrawn. The industry that had fought disclosure for decades adapted, as industries do, to the new regulatory environment and found other ways to protect other interests. The label got a little more honest. Not completely a little. That is still true. And the people who made it true paid a price for making it true that the label does not mention either. I'll see you in the next one.